So we have some people joining us online tonight. So I just wanted to make sure that everybody's on set here at 7 p.m. Welcome to people who are online and that came to join us out in person today. My name's Anna Michijan. I'm the Vegetation Maintenance Supervisor for the city. Happy Pollinator Week. I know we all came here to hear Sam speak. I just wanted to take a couple minutes in recognition of the city's proclamation of Pollinator Week to say a little bit about an effort that the city is making to support pollinators. This project we're calling the Stuart Armstrong Pollinator Arboretum. For those of you who live in the city, you might know about the Stuart Armstrong Garden. If you don't know it by name, you've probably been past it a zillion times. This is the woodlot that's on the corner of Philadelphia, 410, and Holly. And then it's bordered by the Takoma Park Elementary School, just up the hill from where we're sitting tonight. So in 1974, this space was dedicated to local horticulturist Stuart Armstrong. I don't know very much about him, but he was very active in the azalea and horticultural societies, and that's what's reflected in the plantings of the site. But over time, the site has succumbed to some common invasive plant species, as well as abundance of deer browse. What remains are some really impressive canopy trees, evergreen azaleas, and some partially cleared trails. So you may know that I'm relatively new to this position in the city, and when I started, I was obvious that there's like some real possibilities at this site. But before we went into anything really intensively, I wanted to think through what the end goal would be. And last spring, I was invited to a USDA training related to pollen collection and pollinator health. Sam Droege was one of the facilitators, as well as some other really knowledgeable natural resource professionals. And when I was in this training, I realized that there's an opportunity to use this site to tell a story about pollinators, not just how we typically think about them in sunny meadow spots, but in areas a lot like what we have in Takoma Park with maybe woodland edge or forested areas. Because although we do have opportunities for sunny meadow areas, we have a really high level of tree canopy, so 60% basically across the city. So the picture why are these not progressive? Okay. So it's fleshing out this idea about changing the Stuart Armstrong Garden into the Stuart Armstrong Pollinator Arboretum. And we were able to secure some grant funds to help with this work. So what we're hoping for is to keep the character of the site with the historic azaleas, the high canopy cover, but then also enhance the vegetation and create educational opportunities. So the image we're commonly thinking of for pollinator pictures is the colorful one on the bottom, right? But why don't we add some trees into that and make the conversation a little bit more holistic? Because trees are valuable as well. By definition, we're talking about pollinators being creatures that are involved in transporting pollen, usually while feeding on nectar. And trees can provide these things, but also more. So when we're considering how we're helping pollinators, it's important to know a couple other things. They aren't active. Not each one is not active all summer. Some might only live for a couple weeks. Where you find them in the landscape changes through the seasons. But all these things make it even harder to find pollinators in forested areas, or for them to be less noticeable, but they are there. So at this site, we do have some existing plant species that are known to have interactions with specialist pollinators. And as we move forward with the plantings, we do want to encourage these specialists, but really we want to add a lot more native species in general. The more the merrier. We're not going to fixate on any one pollinator. So plants that we're going to include: native, things that flower throughout the year. Very importantly, they need to meet our site limitations, primarily deer browse. And then we are focusing on trees because we're calling it an arboretum, But we also want to reestablish shrubby understory as well as herbaceous layer. That's very important for pollinators. We do, as I mentioned, we do have some pollen and nectar sources on the site already: basswood, tulip poplar, redbud, etc. And these having trees as pollinator species are very important because they're excellent, efficient sources of pollen and nectar. Think about how many flowers are on a tree. They're all up here rather than horizontal. There's a lot there. But also we're going to talk about wind-pollinated species like oaks, and they have non-flora resources that are important for pollinators. So you think about the leaves of the oaks and how crucial they are for larval food of Lepidoptera species. There's also honeydew, which is the excretion of insects, usually higher up in the canopy later on in the summer. And then forested sites also, of course, offering nesting sites and nesting materials, as well as shelter from extreme conditions like heat. So we're going to be talking about floral as well as non-floral resources at these natural sites. So honestly, if you know anything about what we're doing throughout the city, this isn't really unique to what we do at our other sites or what I would recommend that you do at your sites for improving habitat. But what I'm hoping to do is to provide an opportunity for this conversation, expanding on what pollinators need and what we can do. And also that we can make spaces nice for not just us, but also for our smallest residents and visitors. After all, whatever that saying is, it's easy to overlook the forest for the trees, but it also seems to be easy to overlook the forest for the bees, the butterflies, the ants, etc. So that might mean that we need to look up a little more. So thank you all. That's just a little sneak peek. I think it's going to be a fun project. We've just started. I hope you'll come back in a year and check it out. And then as a little administrative note for those of you here in the audience as well as at home, we will be recording this presentation with Sam. You can find it by Googling Takoma Park vegetation. There'll be a link on there. We also will have a short Q&A after the presentations. If you're in the audience with us, we ask that you will proceed to one of the microphones. If you're online with us, you can submit comments into the chat, and we'll field those as we can as well. So with that, sorry, I forgot to say, this whole presentation is in collaboration with the Pollinators group from Climate Action Coffee. So here we have Judy. Sorry.
That's no problem. Hi, and welcome. Again, thank you for joining us tonight, and thank you to Takoma Park for co-hosting this event with us. I'm Judy Rosenthal. I'm part of the Pollinator group, which is part of Climate Action Coffee, which is part of Takoma Park Mobilization. We're fortunate to have Sam Droege tonight of the Bee Lab from the U.S.G.S. Patuxent Wildlife Research Center. He is a wildlife biologist and an internationally known bee expert. Just as the bees he studies, he is native to Maryland. And he grew up in Hyattsville, Maryland, and has been always interested in nature. He has worked at Patuxent since 1978. His work focuses on research on native bees, the plants and insects they interact with, and how to stem some of the losses to wild things that come with population growth, wealth, and disconnection from nature. Sam encourages the widespread use and distribution of native plants that support bee and insect populations. The Bee Lab in Laurel, Maryland is a great place to volunteer and see his work in action. And if you are so inclined at the end to make a donation, he would like the donations to go to the 501(c) nonprofit, the Polistes Foundation, whose mission is to assemble and share knowledge in order to improve education, health, agriculture, economic development, and conservation throughout the world. The Polistes Foundation is named after a genus of social wasps. It supports various programs and projects on bees, birds, and moths. There'll be some folks at the back as you leave with collection buckets. Oh, over that way, thank you. And with that, here is Sam Droege.
All right, we'll get the talk up. Thank you, Judy, Anna. And this is my mic. Well, while we're getting this loaded, I'll say I did grow up in the area just next door in the Lewisdale section of Hyattsville. And it's just really nice to come into Takoma Park and see the changes. When I was a kid, you didn't have all the plantings that are just, it's not a, maybe integrated into a plan, but it's just nice to see how families have moved pollinator plantings, how the food co-op has plantings throughout the area. I just see it all over the place, and that was not the case. Now, the neighborhood I grew up in is probably look exactly the same and is never going to be some hipster neighborhood. But it's nice to see the evolution here. So you're already doing an excellent job. So I might as well just leave if we can't get this talk going. We can hook up my computer too if we need to. It was working.
But you have like, no, it's going to be seen. Yeah.
It's probably because it's a government, PowerPoint.
You have to do it in the PowerPoint itself.
Yeah. Why don't I just close it? And then pull up his.
There we go.
It's
I'm
working.
gonna confess that I misspelled Takoma. I should have known better. Initially. Yeah. All right, we good? So, okay, good. All right, so we don't need this. All right, so I'm going to just flip to the next slide. I'll have contact information at the end, and you're more than welcome to get in touch with us. We're basically a support group, so people who have questions, we tend towards the more technical end, but as Judy and other folks know, we're on the ground growing native plants and looking at bee plant relationships, and we have lots of recommendations, which some of which you'll hear today, only a small number. I'll also mention that we're working on a manuscript, really it's like a monograph.
Sorry.
Oh,
Gonna share this.
that little, yeah, that one I think should work, shouldn't it?
Yeah, we weren't going to Zoom, that's why.
Oh, that's right, we have the Zoom element. Okay, looks good. So we have a monograph of the 450 or so species of bees in Maryland and DC, and you're welcome to email me and ask for that because we have all the species accounts done. And so a lot of that information about who is going to what kind of plant is embedded in there, just light reading. So I want to put some context here. So when a lot of you know something about the notion that all bees are declining or there's an insect apocalypse or bees are in trouble. And I think the way to think about that is, yes, of course they're in trouble. You just think about your house. So if you think about your house, that's not bee habitat. It was at one point bee habitat. And if you think of the square footage of your house, just divide that in half, and that's the number of bees that would have been produced on that piece of land, according to our estimates, per year. So what you're seeing is that houses, this building, the roadsides, cornfields, lots and lots of America really have been made into non-bee habitat. So it's not a mystery. We don't really have to do fancy calculations or go out and do a lot of studies. It's just like, yeah, there are no bees anymore where there's pavement. So that's the big problem, is that we've just lost habitat. But we have this additional one, which we'll be talking about peripherally here, which is that we've also dumbed down America, right? So yes, not everything is paved, but a lot of it is mowed. So lawn has bees in it. If it's weedy, it'll have some, but it's like saying hey, I got birds in my yard. What's the problem? I've got a bird feeder. So it's the same kind of thing. when we look at these things, the complexity has leaked out of a lot of our landscapes. And the objective here today is, and is happening, right? That's what I mentioned when I came in, is that Takoma Park is pretty good. There is a lot of good plantings and different plant species in there that have recreated some of the complexity that was lost by, creating basically a set of houses with mowed grass and 4 conifers at the corners. So we're moving in that right direction, and I'm going to give you some more hints today, very practical ones, I hope, that help with the recovery, restoration, not retribution, but there's another RE in there, reimbursement, what is it? I can't remember. Reclamation, yeah, there's a lot. RE is actually a very good 2-letter thing. Okay, let's not get I can get sidetracked very easily. So we're going to look at it from a practical point of view, but I also want to put into another context here, which is that things happen, right? So 14,000 years ago, which is really not that long, this was right here, this area, this was somewhere between tundra and taiga. It was like the very far northern part of Canada, which has a completely different bee fauna, let alone a plant fauna, which are interrelated, than we have right now. And that wasn't really that long ago, okay? So there's been this huge change. The entire system has flipped to something new. Additionally, at that same time, we now think 20,000 years ago, Indians had been already established in the area, and we can go back through soil sediments and other kinds of lines of evidence, and we can see that the landscape from about that same time, 20,000 years ago, till now, had high components of open landscape features, so pine and other kinds of things that need bare soil. But if you look at how the world works, from many thousands of years ago, this area wants to be forest. It doesn't want to be open. So what was going on by implication is that the Indians kept a lot of this landscape open through burning. That was their tool. They didn't have bulldozers. You'll find out when you try to cut down a tree with a stone axe that it just doesn't work well, but fire works really well. So the place was heavily manipulated, and what happened is you had the whole prairie-like fauna moving east over the mountains. They were also highly burned. And then you had, especially from the south, you had a lot of the fire-adapted component, which is naturally fire-adapted. So Central Florida, for example, burns all the time, highest lightning strike in the nation, and the number of natural fires are huge. So that created an avenue to the north. And so we can look at the plants, we can look at lots of other kinds of creatures, including bees, and we realize that despite the fact that this landscape wants to be trees, we have many, many different kinds of species, and the turnover isn't just something that we have trashed right now, right? So we can say, oh, look at us. Since colonization, we have really chewed up this area, and we've done it several different ways in several different eras in which we have gone from forest to open, now back to forest, urbanized and not. But that's a history that goes back those 20,000 years. And then we had those darn glaciers, which ended in Pennsylvania, coming down, flipping the area too. So I guess my message here is, what is natural is a really difficult thing to kind of wrap our heads around. And what are the native plants in the area is also relatively tricky because of this history where we had indigenous burning, we had a long term, and we had a lot of climate change at the same time. So I think that gives us a lot of freedom to rethink where we are going. You'll see that basically my next message, I don't even know if did I cover everything there? Sure. Yeah. So, again, if we do nothing, we're going to get it all back to forest. But of course, we're doing everything because we're like mowing our grass and having ball fields. So we retain these components. But again, the human aspect of it, we want a transmission line that is looks like lawn, all these kinds of trajectories that society puts on us is to simplify our environments. So my argument and others is, no, let's bring back complexity into these, but not worry too much about what the nativity of some of the plants are in terms of the details. Yes, we want native plants, but it doesn't necessarily have to, there's no one list. It's like generalized for the entire East. So I'll give you my end pitch right now, which is basically that saving bees is about saving and incorporating native plants back into environments where they've been retracted. Oops. Looks like my talk is saying that you better hurry up or you're never going to finish. And and it's situational. So we have a lot of freedom, but a very basic answer to what should I be doing in my yard or my landscape is you want native plants. And if you're doing bees, which is different from other species, which are not a one-off thing, is you want bloom from spring to fall as continuous as possible, and you're going to be doing 80% of a good job. And then we will have some fun with talking about some of the plantings and the possibilities and some of the nuance that the bee plant world has given us. So when we look at Takoma Park, spelled wrong, darn it, I forgot to get that one fixed. So if you think about Tree City, which I think was what it was called when I was a kid, I can't remember if that was true, but you have a lot of residual canopy trees. There's a lot of trees in here, so it's shade dominated, but the way it works is you have lots of canopy, so your yards are shady, but you also have light coming in from all the sides. You basically can have all the full spectrum of plants. Because the native plants are also adapted to living in an environment that often gets partially shaded. So Takoma Park is a pretty good place for almost everything, and you can just drive through and see this kind of spectrum. So it's really a lovely spot to think about recovering back to its original state. So a little background. And also there's lots of little residual spots. You know, we can go to any little small park in the area and you can see elements that are still there from what was 100 years ago or 75 years ago that are full of native components. And we've done studies in Sligo Creek and a couple other spots within the region that shows that the woodland species of bees are still largely intact. So there's, again, lots of opportunities to recreate a naturalized system more and more instead of less and less, which happens in most cities. So if we look at the bee species, which we're not going to dwell on, so Montgomery County, we have a list of 257 different kinds of species, each species doing something slightly different, right? They're not doing the same thing or they wouldn't be different species. PG County, 306. I grew up in PG County, and so I'm like, there you go. PG County wins again. So DC, 227, and a lot of that's residual. So when the National Museum started, over 100 years ago, they had an entomology department, and they just rode the trolley lines and the little feeder railroads to different spots. And so they would go to Calorama, which was farmland. They would go to different parts of Northern Virginia. They'd go to Glen Echo, and it would be the wilderness, and they'd find all kinds of cool bees that we can't find anymore. But but there still are within DC, Rock Creek Park, Potomac in particular, is a lovely spot. Anacostia has plenty of interesting bee species, and the rest is being replanted back in. So, but if we look at that list and say, okay, well, what are the bees that are really tolerant of the 450 species that are in Maryland that are really tolerant of urban areas? In other words, we can find more in an urban area than we can outside. And there's about 50 species, which is actually quite a bit of species of bees that really actually thrive in an urbanized environment. In other words, they're in your yards. Almost all those species are flying over, and often, because you guys are all gardeners and have wonderful native plant gardens, are visiting you, whether you know that or not. So building out that floral base, that those floral species list for the region, for the neighborhood, for your yard is going to incrementally add more species, because a lot of these bee species are using only a small number of plants. And we'll talk about this. That'll be kind of a message throughout the rest of it. And so if you want to do things, you can do things in your yard. It's just a matter of planting. Just a couple of little facts. So when you think about how much pollen, how many flowers does a bee need to create one baby bee? And the answer is roughly 5 flowers. And those are of some mythical, average flower size, which is not much. If you look at a big annual sunflower head, there's enough pollen in that head for more than 100 bee nests. So the amount of pollen and nectar, if you just imagine the amount of flowers within whatever part of the state, region, yard, or whatever, particularly trees, and you'll realize that there is enough food out there for thousands of bees, okay? And that's true. And sometimes you can see that one apple tree or the willow or whatever is blooming, you look up and it's just covered with bees. I mean, there are a lot of bees. We estimate the average acre has 28,000 bees being produced per acre on average throughout the region. So, but don't forget, like, they're bugs. Think of ants in your house, right? You've got those little mini ants that are coming out. They're working the same kind of idea. It doesn't take much energy to create a baby ant. It doesn't take that much energy to create a baby bee. Your house could have several, not that your house has this, but your house could have, a house in Takoma Park could have many thousands of ants living in it. So it's the same thing. It's just a little bit different scale, and we don't tend to think of it in a lot of depth. So let's go and just talk about some of these plant relationships. And we have a website that talks about the highly specialized relationships. So, for example, here's Lyonia, which is, I think the common name is, it's got several, Fetterbush, Mailberry. It looks like Pyralis. So that's the Japanese Pyralis. I think it's Pyralis. Is it Pyralis? Japanese? What am I'm doing? Am I getting that name right? Pardon? Pieris, yeah. Which there's a native one in the south, but the one that you see planted. But Lyonia looks almost exactly the same. And the Pieris that is planted does have some bees on it. But this particular plant, and there's several different species of it, but up here we usually see one particular one, has several bees that only go to that plant. So you can see one of the ones. Check out the mandibles on that one Melita melatoides up there at the top. There's stuff going on when you have mandibles that look like that. And so it's part of that system where you balkanize things. So individual groups of plants have crafted a certain mix of pollen and nectar, a certain bloom time, a certain type of chemical composition for that pollen and nectar, and a floral presentation, a floral scent, a floral shape that match those giant choppers in that particular case. And there's 2 other species of bees that also are only on Lyonia, but we are not planting Lyonia. You can get it. I think there's a couple regional nurseries that carry it to some extent, but would be very high on my list to add to your yard, because that bee can show up in your yard, but only if you have that planted. And it could be a great replacement for any number of those little ornamental kinds of hedgy shrub things that you might be picking up. Here, in keeping with this sort of ericaceous, so that's the species of plants that are often associated with acidic soils, so blueberries and of different kinds. And so vaccinium is the scientific name, and here's one species, Vaccinium staminium. And if you look at that plant, it is a blueberry, and you can pluck a blueberry off of it later in the summer, so there's a positive. And I'll do an aside here while I'm thinking of it, which is like plant blueberries, because unlike most of the commercial growers' goals for shrubs and other kinds of flowers, a blueberry that you plant has to produce blueberries, which means it has to attract bees. And therefore, any kind of variety of blueberry that's any good is going to be good for bees. But that's not necessarily true for, say, a flowering cherry, where they might say, oh, let's double the sepals in it and do all kinds of crafty things. That often means that the pollen and nectar is robbed so that it could have bigger flowers, longer flowers, shorter stature, better bloom time, because that's not what the plant breeder is asking. But in our crop species, the answer always is you have to produce the fruit, right? And that's going to mean for a lot of our brambles and other crops like apples and cherries, a bee has to be involved. So it's automatically a positive. Anyway, I digress far too often in these talks. So anyway, here's deerberry, which is a kind of blueberry. But if you look at the shape on that, it's shaped differently, and it has its own set of specialist bees that are only going to that particular variety of vaccinium. Also, what is also in the vaccinium genus, that's cranberries. So the cranberries we eat are native to the region. They also have to be pollinated by bees, so they also are good, and they also have their own set of cranberry bees that go to them. And then the other species, I don't think I have any pictures of them. The other species of blueberries have yet another set, and this is the kind of blueberries that we normally plant. They have sort of a vase-shaped flower. Well, those have a different set of bees that have very long faces so that they can stick their face up into that bell-shaped flower, which is dangling down, which makes it even more difficult. So they have their own design to get, into that. These bees are often very tiny, and they're also the kinds of things we just don't even recognize as bees, right? So we know bee, and the bee is a honeybee. And so if it doesn't look like a honeybee, then it's a bug, and we don't register, most of us, except for maybe bumblebees or something. So, but there is a lot going on in your yards, and it doesn't necessarily look like the honeybee. So in this particular case, now we're still in the sort of the ericaceous group, which is good for the area because it's kind of acidic soils, I would think, in this part of the world. And as I was talking to Anna earlier, it's also a good place for deer, which love to eat all the native azaleas. But the native azaleas, which is very different from the kind of fluorescent colored, I guess some of the natives could be fluorescent colored from the Smokies, but the Himalayan hybrid azaleas that most people plant, there are a few kinds of bees, including an invasive bee from that part of the world that loves all the Himalayan azaleas. That's this little Anthophora that people love to take pictures of. It's all over Takoma Park in DC, and nests under your deck a lot of times. And people wonder, what is this thing that I don't remember seeing until recently? But it's living off your fake azaleas. And the native species have a bee that pollinates or gathers pollen only from it. Now, it may or may not actually be a good pollinator. So take a look at the native azaleas. I don't know if I can show this a little bit, but what you're seeing, see all those sticky outy things? Those are stamens. And the thing is that most flowers don't stick their stamens way out there. And in general, if you see that, then that flower has at least some likelihood, maybe it's bats, but that would be the tropics. But in these particular cases, it's after butterflies, right? So think about a butterfly, your standard butterfly, long legs, long tongue, it's not intersecting with a lot of the pollen carrying elements of a little, let's think of a blackberry or something. So mostly they're crappy pollinators. But in this case, these groups are in particular, I believe they're targeting the big butterflies like tiger swallowtails and things like that. This is what they're after, but a very small bee climbs out to the end of the stamens and harvests the the pollen off it. Now, I just am not an expert on that species. So is it robbing that plant? It certainly is only found on those native azaleas. It's possible, like I don't know where the stigma is on these things. I'd have to look. But it's possible that it also is pollinating. But I know for sure that the floral design is a butterfly design. So again, lots of really interesting complexity there, and almost no other bee species are found on that particular plant except for that one specialist that has its thing there. So if you don't plant those native azaleas, you don't get that bee. But if you do plant it, you almost guaranteed to get it. So like I've gone down and done surveys at the National Arboretum and the Germplasm Center where they have collections, not huge numbers of those native azaleas, and that bee's there. At Patuxent, we have pinksters and swamp azaleas scattered here and there. There's that bee pretty much guaranteed. So here's another one that's very similar to that, but much more commonly planted. So these are the group of cornus, so those are the dogwoods, not the big flowering dogwood, which has mostly, sadly, been nailed by the anthracnose that moved into the area. As a kid, I can remember, even when I was beyond kid age, that I would drive in the spring and all the woods, the interior of the woods were just white with flowering dogwoods. And now you'll just see a few on the edge where it can kind of eke out a living without getting the fungus nailing it. Anyway, sad, but that's what it is now. But there's another group which I believe now has been moved from a subgenus of Cornus to its own group called Swida. Is that true? Do we know? Is it Swida is the genus now? Yeah. Okay. So anyway, these things, you know those taxonomists are always playing around with names. But these are the shrubby dogwoods, so things like silky, alternate-leaved, red osier, and then there's probably several more. That group there has somewhere, I think in Maryland, there might be 3 different species of bees that only go to that group. As you expand out to other states, it's probably more like 5 or 6 species. You don't have those plants, you don't have those bees. This is relatively common in the trade, so you'll see this pretty regularly. I'm sure people aren't going like, oh my gosh, so I'm going to buy this plant. But that's what they're doing. And guaranteed, if you plant any, at least, again, do all of them support that bee? I'm not 100% sure. But the common ones like silky, if you see a blooming silky shrub, silky dogwood shrub, you're going to have a little flock of those bees, those specialist bees on that plant. Andrena fragilis in this case, and then there's several less common ones on there. It's a nice plant. It's in the trade all over the place because someone likes the look of it, but it's also super supportive. Here's another interesting one that is well entrenched within the gardening world. So these are the Oenotheras. So these would be the evening primroses or primroses or sundrops, and there's a variety of different species you can see in here. So the classic evening primrose, which is more or less a weed, and for most people, but I let mine grow, and then of course I got 5 million babies the next year. But the evening primrose is a good example. So they bloom just close to dark. Why do they do that? Because their bee comes out close to dark and all the rest of the competing pollinators are done. Like the average bee, like when we go bee collecting, we don't get up early because the bees aren't out, which is kind of one of the nice things about studying bees. Somewhere between 9 and 10, maybe the action starts picking up, and then by 3 it starts draining off. But morning glories have their own set of early morning bees, and then in the evening you have evening primrose and a couple other species. You go to the deserts and it's even more that way. And so again, it's this linkage where the flower, the plant says, I am interested in maximizing my seed count or my pollination. So I'm going to do a bunch of things that really necks down the group of bees that can work with me. And then over time, it gets even more and more extreme. So for example, there's a whole series of bees that only go to these Enithera species, not all of which just bloom in the evening. And so one of the things they do is they have these byssal threads. So basically it's like sticky wads of hard to deal with pollen. It's all connected together, and you need to have basically special bee tools to handle that. So most bees don't. They just get gummed up and they go like, I'm never going back to that plant. And they also have a very different chemical composition too. And so that combination has led to that group of plants having a series of specialist bees associated with them. But you can go into New York City and go to plantings of this plant, and you will find the specialist bee, at least some of them, on those plants. So here's another group of plants that you can add to your gardens that has a very uncommon bee. In other words, in our studies of bees, when we just go out and trap or we go out netting, we rarely, I've only a handful of these species in my collection, but if I go to that particular plant at that particular time in a garden setting, I can find it. So most of our records come from people's gardens. Some of that is because we know they're in the gardens and we know where to go, and so we do that rather than go out late in a more wilder area. So they're, I'm sure, in both places, but if you don't look, you never find these things. And there's not that many people who go and look for bees. So we're still way on the learning curve. But here's something that can be done right in your yards if you plant that species. You don't plant that species, those bees are not there. So here, again, it's not like if you're planting your basic begonias, pansies, coleus and all those other kinds of traditional plants, you're supporting almost nothing. Okay, even butterfly bush like Buddleia, that does have bees on it, but it's analogous to the bird feeder. If I put up a bird feeder, I have birds all over it. In fact, I have more birds than in the wild. So have I done a good conservation thing by having a bird feeder? The answer essentially is no, because those birds do not need our support. It's just something that we like to look at. Same thing with Buddleia. So Buddleia has bees, but it's mostly honeybees and the very, it's like crow and sparrow bees, these ones that are happy with almost any kind of supply of pollen and nectar. So adding certain kinds of plants, is this going forward on its own? No. Okay. Is very important in terms of supporting rather than attracting. Okay. So we want to support bee populations. That means these less common ones that need our help, and not just simply attract bees. It's like attracting birds is different from supporting birds. You're not doing a lot for conservation with the bird feeder, nor are you with a lot of the common kinds of non-native plants, because there are bees. It's not a bad thing in a certain level, but it's also not really supporting the species that we would like to. Just some more examples. So again, thinking about Takoma Park as a largely treed landscape already within the residential system, which would mean that the kinds of plants that thrive within forests, again, I'm ignoring the fact that you have deer, is really the way to go. So a lot of these spring ephemerals, particularly if you're on the slightly wetter, richer soil end of the spectrum, or at the other end, you're at the ericaceous, shrubby, huckleberry, and rhododendron and azalea end of the spectrum, is where all the action is. So within a forest environment, by May, if it's a closed canopy, there's nothing going on in there for bees. All the flowers and plants from the canopy on down have finished blooming. So you can add this component into any of your plantings. You got that sort of thuggy red maple that you made the mistake 40 years ago of planting. Well, plant, Claytonia and some of these spring things that are able to eke out a living in that short period of time between canopy closure and early spring. And there's lots of options within there. Here's another whole group of plants I was going to take some pictures of our pretty extensive beds of Lysomachia at work because it's a lovely plant just from a plant point of view. You also don't see it that much within the trade, but Lysomachia, the native Lysomachias are loosestrifes. So you have, I won't go in, I'm going to be here forever if I go into all the details, but they usually spread by runners, not super aggressively, and so they make great bedding plants. So you can literally just have a bed of Lysomachia in there. And from a natural history point of view, the interesting thing is that they are producing oils. I believe it's oils on the lips of the flowers. I could be wrong. And this particular bee, Macropus group, so there's several species of bees, they require those oils to be added to the pollen and nectar load. In fact, I'm not even sure they're using nectar, but I believe so. But they have to have this plant. And so this beautiful yellow flower, which blooms for about 7 weeks, is still blooming strongly right now at in my on our research gardens, has a specialist bee that only goes to that particular plant. And it's a wonderful a addition to any garden in the area. And it also can, most of them can handle at least partial shade to often a fairly heavy shade within the garden system. So here's another plant group. So this is ground cherries, so physalis. And so the interesting about physalis is that it includes tomatillos. So tomatillos are a species of physalis that's derived from the highlands of Mexico probably, and isn't native here, but it will also pick up some of the native bees that are physalis specialists. And I think, and I have a big planter filled with the physalis, I think it's longifolia, I could be wrong, and at the lab, and it's a beautiful shaped plant and has all these lovely, just like tomatillos if you ever grow them, lovely dangling flowers, and it is just a circus of Caletes latitarsus, which is the specialist bee. But there's several other species that are much less common, but are also specialists. No ground cherry, those species are gone. You know, lots of little questions like, remember Chinese lanterns, which, you know, our parents and grandparents grew? Those are physalis, but those are from Asia. So are they good or not? These are the kinds of interesting questions that we eventually we'll try and work through at the lab and elsewhere. So another overlooked group, I think, are the wild beans and peas. So these are Galactia and Strophostyles, and they're around. So you can see particularly the Strophostyles on a lot of woodland roads and edges of forests, and they're sort of just this kind of thing that's around. You just tend to ignore them, but they'll grow up fences, and once you plant them, you sort of get them forever because they reseed pretty freely. Also very easy, not like morning glories, to pull out. And there is a series of bees, a lot of the leafcutter related families of bees that are using the members of species, particularly within Fabaceae, so the pea family. But the pea family is very broad. It includes trees, it includes vines like the peas here, and things like Baptisia and lupin. And so there are many, many different sort of strategies and groupings of bees and plants. But one of the ones that are incredibly uncommon have to do with the species of bees that come to the viney peas. So adding, which again, most gardeners don't add these in because you have to have a fence, and they're not like, why would you have that when you could have like the whatever that trailing garden pea is that you see pretty frequently. So this is that species of pea. We actually saw some when we were up with Anna in her edge of her woods. That species of peas doesn't really work for these rare native species, but the native species of beans do. So more peas are a good thing. Here's another bedding plant that can be used when you have plenty of space because it will spread gallantly. You see this a lot more in Western Maryland than here, but it's around, is woodland sunflowers. So it's also a really tough species of plants. It can beat up a lot of the invasive species. You can put in a bed and just walk away, and you don't ever want to put it in one of your nice garden beds because it's going to take over the whole thing. But when you have property and you need something at the woodland edge, maybe a little dangerous around deer again, because they often tend to like these helianthus. But that species supports a whole series of different kinds of leafcutter bees and several other kinds of species, including this thing here called Paranthidium jugatorium, which doesn't have a common name, but it's very colorful, and it's very uncommon because it only works with the woodland sunflower group of the sunflowers. So woodland sunflowers are perennial, unlike the sort of annual sunflower that we think of as coming in. Maybe it would actually visit the annual sunflower, but its core is the woodland sunflower. So again, this kind of message of diversity of different kinds of plants, not simply the kinds of things you can go to a big box store and purchase, are what's supporting a lot of the plants. If we just simply went to Lowe's and used Lowe's selection of plants to be our, natural history, natural support, we're helping nature, we're helping bees, we would actually lose many, many different kinds of species of bees doing that. So working with your native plant society and with some of the other native plant nurseries, which we have several really good ones in the area. You can just type in Native Plant Nursery Maryland, and you'll get the Maryland Native Plant Society's listing, which I think leaks over into Northern Virginia too. And they have good selections. So thistles are another interesting thing. So we have bull thistle and Canada thistle as sort of very invasive weeds, and so they move into like cereal crops and other kinds of row crop situations and become very problematic for the farmers. They're a contaminant within the food system, and see how spiny and relatively poisonous the seeds are, as far as I understand. So they do everything they can to eliminate them. They're also tend to be so the Canada thistle is perennial and is very difficult to move out of a crop, and the bull thistle just loves to shed its seeds and grows almost anywhere that you have disturbed soil. But there's a whole series of native thistles that occur in the area that are not that as aggressive. They aren't really pests, but they look just like the other thistles, and so they almost inevitably get axed out of our systems because people don't take the time to differentiate the different species. But on those thistles are several different kinds of bees that are thistle specialists. So no thistles, those species disappear. And so some of the native thistles, my favorite, I don't have a picture. Oh, I do. See the yellow one on the upper left? That's Cirsium horridulum. And it tends to be a sand lover. So if you don't have really sandy soil, it doesn't do very well. But it is just a magnificent, thorny little, relatively short spring blooming plant. And that big blue osmia there, which is that colored blue, comes to it. And we see that where we see it in a native context is on the barrier islands and then just to the sandy side of the eastern shore, and then to the south. So it's very commonly seen to the south there on that sand. Here's another one that has implications within our garden environment. So there are many different kinds of morning glories. A lot of them, like bindweed, are really tricky, hard to deal with weeds. This is the picture here is of Ipomaea pandurata. So it's very closely related to actually sweet potatoes. In fact, it looks a little bit like it. But so this is often called manroot. It does have a somewhat edible root, although most people say it really doesn't taste very good, so who wants it? But it's a perennial morning glory, has blooms, roughly this size. It's in many ways a beautiful plant. In the south, in sandy soils, it can be weedy, but it has a series of bees, including that lovely big Cimolobus ipomaea, that only go to that plant and are only out early in the morning. So that plant, just like squashes, which also have their own bees, that plant opens before dawn and there's a little bit of activity. That bee is moving around, gathering the pollen and nectar out of the ipomaeas. The ipomaeas close up by mid-morning. That bee is done, and that's the MO of the morning glories, which is like, I don't have to deal with a lot of other bees that are not pollinating my flowers very efficiently, and essentially they're stealing pollen and nectar from me because I'm just going to open shop so early that they're not even going to be out there. So, but it makes a lovely, you can see it's right on a fence there. It's, just as nice as the, heavenly blue and the other kinds of traditional morning glories, which, depending, there are other morning glory specialist bees that are a little more Catholic in their tastes and will leak over to the bindweeds and other things. But that big bee is only on that big Ipomaea, the native one. So why not grow that one? So ragworts, this is something Pachyra. This is sort of like your entry plant for many native plant growers. The interesting thing is, so we have a specialist bee on that genus. So Andrena gardneri is only on that. And we also have a parasitic bee that is parasitic on Andrena gardneri. So, and interestingly, even though we just discovered its relationship, it was named Nomata Senecio-phylla. Senecio was the old, this is like really nerdy talk. So Senecio was the old name for Pachyra, and Phylla would mean lover of Senecio. But now we put it all together and like, oh, of course you're found on Senecio or Pachyra because you're waiting for the bee that you parasitize to come by so you can go back to its nest and lay your egg in it, and then your baby will eat its baby and eat all the food. So just a little bedtime story for the children. And so, but there's, within that world, almost everyone plants Pachyra aurea, I believe, is the most common one. And I can find that in the woods. But when we're out looking for the specialist bee, the smalls ragwort is, I think, Pachyra anomala. Yeah, and that's almost never planted. So, is it? And it blooms a lot later. It's blooming, it's finishing up now, and so then there's all these questions like, well, yes, I'm helping the specialist bee, but maybe I'm not because maybe it's the other species that's being grown. So these are sort of in the works for us. Certainly, the regular, everyone's got it, ragwort that everyone shares and says, oh, try this, and it grows everywhere, is supporting bees. Like we see plenty on there, but whether it's doing this whole system, not clear, because we've only seen that those species in these very in some of these big natural areas, like up at Soldier's Delight. That system is going on, but it's all the Smalls ragwort and not the other spring one that's in the bottomlands. But then you get to Western Maryland and it gets interesting. Okay, new group. So here's Calides estivalis. So it's one of these cellophane bees. It nests underground, lines its nest with a waxy cellophane thing that it makes from one of its glands, and it's a specialist on heuchera. So you can see in the bottom picture, that's the known distribution of past records. I've never collected the species in Maryland, and that almost certainly had to do with probably collections on Plummer's Island. So it's recorded from Montgomery County here, and then if you look at the distribution of heuchera within the state, Heuchera americana, there's several species. You can see it's very extensive. But, if you look at, we like to plant heuchera, and mostly those are hybrids, by the way, so probably not attractive to this bee. But it's got lovely sort of plant form the whole year, and then it's got a few flowers, but no one's like buying that plant for the flowers, right? So in the wild, the plant tends to be extremely hidden. It's often on cliff faces, it's often on riverbanks, it's in places that you don't see, which means that nobody sees it, nobody's going to collect bees off it, but is the only place that this one bee occurs. But so, for example, Wendy is part of the plant trade, and we were talking, and she said, Sam, what's this bee on my heuchera? Is it the rare heuchera bee? And she lives up in York County, just across the border. And sure enough, it was. And I went up there to just check because it was so unusual. And it wasn't like she was in this pristine area. It was like any sort of semi-rural Pennsylvania neighborhood, and there were maybe 6 or 7 plants on it. And we've seen this now several times, that when people plant the straight species, and there's a couple other species that bloom in the spring, not the fall blooming heucheras, that would have this too, they get it. So when you're doing your gardens and you want to get your heuchera plants, just try and get them as the straight species rather than the hybrids. And you may be helping out a bee that a lot of people thought had completely disappeared from the east. Like it was on the list, the short list of possibly endangered species. But the answer is no, it's probably everywhere, just no one's looking. And also, we're not planting it enough within our garden environments. We're just playing around with all these hybrids. So here's one of the few trees that have specialists. So trees, we'll talk about in a second, as a very important factor in the spring for bees. The Castanea group, which is chinkapin, and essentially 2 species of chinkapin and the American chestnut, were species that bloomed like they just finished up. Okay, so it was the last tree in the woods that was producing pollen and nectar. So it extended the spring bloom in forests till just a little while ago, whereas everything else had largely finished up. So it was a kind of a keystone pollinator plant for woodland bees because it bloomed so late. So we know the story. American chestnut is pretty much tanked. There's a lot of work trying to recover them. I won't tell you about how we figured out that there was a bee, this one here, Andrina rennie, that only goes to chestnut. But when we now go to the hybrid chestnut tree orchards, we can find this bee. But we found it nowhere else. We thought it had essentially also gone extinct. But it turns out it was only on chestnuts, which now we know, and we can find it on the other small chestnut that no one ever plants or thinks about but should, and this is one of my arguments, that you should be planting chinkapins in your yard. First of all, it's not a giant tree, and secondly, it can produce and cycle through. Eventually, it gets whacked by the I think is it a fungus, maybe, that impacts the chestnut trees? But it takes quite a long time, and they produce nice spiny fruit, and it has lovely bloom, and then you would be supporting Andrina rennie on that particular plant. So, yes, you can help many of the chestnut kinds of plants, but don't get sucked into the American chestnut is the only species out there that we care about. You should be caring about the other species that are not as big of chestnuts, which includes these chinkapins. I put in a double slide there. Okay, we're moving out of the towards the ends of the talk here. Just a couple sort of summary slides. So I just put this in here because I think a lot of you realize when my talks here that we have a lot of different species besides honeybees. So when I look at here, the issue largely is that when you think about bees, you're automatically pulling from your Rolodex of honeybee information, right? Because everybody knows honeybees, and we also just culturally know a lot about them. The best way to think about that, how good of a model honeybees are for thinking about native bees, is to say that anything you know about honeybees, that does not occur in the native species. Okay, so they're not a good model. So, don't come up afterwards and say, well, hey, I want to get a hive of native bees or whatever. It's all different. It's a very different thing. Honeybees are highly specialized, really radical species compared to all the other bees in the world, special, and we can actually put them in a box and move them around and get honey out of them. None of that is a thing that we can do with our native species. They're almost all solitary, and they have very complex but different lifestyles. So I want to contrast that, because a lot of times people will then paste in a bunch of honeybee information into what, like you're learning here today. So different, very different things. Okay, so we talked about a lot of these kinds of things. The thing is, I can see that really well, but I can't see this really well without these on. So I'm always tempted to look over there. So bees, we talked about this. So bees have divorced themselves from the woods at this point. There are a few species that nest in rotting logs, which is a point here to make, which is a lot of times, and not so much here probably in Takoma Park, but probably to some extent, a tree falls, we clean it up, we chip it, and we throw it away, right? So to some extent, you want to leave at least some of the logs lying around, because as they rot over time, they are providing some bees with the habitat that they need to nest in, which is rotting logs. Sometimes they will use basically rot pockets in trees, but there are many other insects that use that as a habitat. So keep a few in the back 40, someplace that, well, if you're like me, you're going to put it in your front 40 because you like looking at what's going on. But if you're like probably most neighborhoods, you want to put that in the back somewhere. So leave some of that around. So here's a list of bee trees. So there's species, lots of species of trees that are really of no interest to bees. Now, plenty of interest to other insects. So think of Doug Ptolemy's work again. But so if we look through here, you can read what I'm talking about here on some of these different kinds of species as there a little bit of notes of pros and cons. But a couple, chinkapin, we talked about that. That's the one that I'm really kind of pushing. But black gum is another underrated plant. So it has actually, who pays attention to black gum, first of all, but it has beautiful little sparkly flowers. So they're not big and white, but they produce copious amounts of nectar. If you're a honeybee person, you know this. Gum is a super important bee plant, particularly as you move south and you move into swamps or up in the hills. But around here, black gum occurs quite frequently. You don't ever hear of like, oh, I was in a black gum forest. But in almost every habitat, you will get some black gum coming in. And if you were to do some black gum gazing, you would see that in the fall, they're the first to color up. They have really actually kind of quite nice shapes. They are not super fast growing. They can be in the woods. They can be in the open. They really are something to think about incorporating back into some of your landscapes when you're thinking about putting a tree in. And maples are another interesting one because they're really the first pollen and nectar source in most situations in the spring. And a lot of times they're hedging their bets. So they do a little wind pollinating, a little self-pollinating, and then they attract insects. So red maple are doing a lot of heavy lifting in that very early spring, mostly too cold, but every once in a while there's a warm day. You look up in a red maple tree that's blooming and you'll see there's quite a bit of bee activity going on there. And then when it gets cold again, all the bees go back in the ground because they're mostly in the ground at that time of year. And they wait for it to come back out. And then the maple trees are sort of following that same kind of pattern. So we talked about this too. You have in the forest system, you have things like bottomlands and filled with all kinds of native vernal plants, but not anymore in the area because lesser celandine has taken over that system. Don't get me started. All the way to super dry, rocky forests where you have lots and lots of understory of huckleberry and blueberries and rhododendrons and mountain laurels, to each of which different groups of bees are visiting. Then we have this rosaceous family, so blackberries, a lot of the things that are going to be within our fruits category, so black cherry, apples, and things, but lots of ornamentals. So again, it's something that's kind of overlooked. So we plant a lot of these ornamental trees that give us that, oh, look at all that bloom along the street, and, this little lollipops. And a bunch of them are no particular friend to bees because they're hybrids or they're doubled or they've been overcultivated. But you can go by a lot of them and see a fair amount of bee action. So it's the same story. If it's a hybrid, pretty much forget it. But if it's a straight species, even if it's been modified and is a varietal, a lot of times there's going to be a fair amount of bee action on it. And if you look at crabs, so crab apples, if it produces crab apples, pollinators are using it. Crab apples, genus Malus, native to Eastern North America as well as other parts of the world, whereas apples are more like Carpathian Mountains or something like that. But it's the same story. All these plants, including blackberries, if you look at the flower, it's super simple. So similar to the ilex and the hollies. It's a little open flower like a kid would draw, and there's a platform. Any bee can land on that flower and have as much pollen and nectar as it wants. It basically are party plants. Like what they're saying is, we're not going to bloom for that long, but we're going to dump a huge amount of pollen and nectar in this gigantic three-dimensional thing, what we call a tree, and we're just inviting everybody, and we're going to get pollinated. And so that's that system. So that actually, those species, those rosaceous species, many of which you can plant and get food out of, are supporting a huge variety of bees. No specialists, so no bee can specialize on it because it blooms such a short period of time. But bees are not like we only do one thing all the time. So if you're a heuchera specialist, you do need heuchera, but nectar you can get from anything. So a lot of bees are going to end up on these generalized nectar-giving systems too. So what I'm saying is, plant your fruit trees, plant these ornamentals, but look closely at the ornamental and see if they have a simpler bloom and they have just a species name and they don't have a variety associated with them. Probably better. We don't really have that list that says these plant varieties are the best ones, although we're moving in that direction because we do have the National Arboretum to study. Okay, so again, that's part of that spring system. So think of those trees and that rosaceous family of woody plants. That's part of this big spring push. So if you zoom out of Takoma Park, you'll see that there is a lot of pollen and nectar going on in this tree third dimension, whereas you're just looking down at that pollinator garden in the neighbors that isn't even starting to go. But there's lots going on above your head. So here's some list of party plants. The other thing is, not so much here, because really you can think of Takoma Park as a giant edge, right? So if you go out to a forest or to a park, what you have is almost always a continuous closed canopy of forest. And then if you look at what's going on in there, particularly if you're like me and you're hunting bees, you go inside there to hunt the low spring herbaceous vernal spring blooming plants, trilliums, dogtooth violet, spring beauties. And there's a lot of shrubs in there and other things, but they are just sitting there and they're waiting for a disturbance, like a hurricane, a fire, a mastodon in the old days, and all kinds of things to break the canopy, bring some sunlight in, then they're ready to go. The action in terms of those plants are on the edges. So in the old days, it would be streams, rivers, disturbance events of different kinds. Now it's woodland. Woodlands are cut by forests, by driveways. So even if you have a largely forested property, you have a driveway into your property. That driveway is a cut into the canopy, at least to some extent, so more light is coming in. That's a planting opportunity. That area is going to produce bloom because it's getting energy, which is called sunlight, into those spots. So using that to plant your shrubs and your woodland flowers, but particularly, like shadbush and some of these others, when you drive by in the countryside, you'll see in the spring the little pinkster azaleas, the shadbush, they're blooming on the edges. nothing's going on in the woods. So think edge, like we create a lot of edge. So that's an opportunity, and it's often, we often have to clean up a lot of invasives before we get there. Hollies are another good thing to stick in there. And actually, interestingly, American holly is doing amazingly well, must be because deer don't like it, in a lot of our woods, way more than they had in the past. They're just invading everywhere. It's kind of interesting. I don't know what the holly story there is, but it's cool. So these are more of the shrubs that are edge. There's a scrub component. So Lyonia blooms in June, right? So another reason to plant Lyonia, because it's a late blooming shrub, because it's designed to be in a scrub habitat. So it would normally be, say, in the edge of a bog, edge of a lake, and we see it in power line cuts, not deep in the forest, because it's blooming so late in the year. It needs pollinators to be active. In the forest in June, there's nothing going on. So it's always a scrub species. We'll see it in coastal areas that traditionally have had a lot of disturbance. Sumacs. So sumacs are we got to cut out on the time there? Okay. I'm getting a signal from someone in the audience. So the sumacs are another species that I like to add in. You have to trim them out because they spread a lot, but they're blooming right now, another late season plant. And so I'm just about done. Manage your edges for biodiversity. If you're a municipality, you want to work with them because it's the road crews that do a lot of the habitat manipulation. And instead of like, oh my gosh, we have to create a new, pollinator garden and we're going to spend tons of money and, convert this area of lawn. Yes, that's good. But if you just tell the, work with the facilities people and say, hey, that edge around the playing fields that no one uses, don't mow that except once a year in the winter. Boom, you have within 1 year, you have freed up thousands and thousands of acres. Same would be for transmission lines, road edges, all kinds of things. Changing the mowing regime is actually the most effective way to bring back pollinator fields. So here's that one mower deck. That's pretty easy to do. Just don't mow that mower deck away from the edge of the woods around the playing fields except once a year. And so transmission lines is another one. This is, and you can get this from me, this is the place where all the specialist bee plant relationships are listed. They're not super rare things. And then the use of, again, within facilities, they're often blowing herbicides as the easiest way to do things, right? Herbicides, the problem, mowing at least kills the tops but leaves the bottoms. Things can resprout. Most of the herbicides, the design is we want to convert this landscape to grass, and all the perennials and all the woody plants are killed to the roots and don't come back. So again, this dumbing down kind of approach to the problem. So obviously, if you have an invasive, you don't have a native, so get rid of them. Obviously, there's several ways to get rid of deer. Arlington does this very effectively. And this is my very last slide. So when I'm flipping lawns, so lawns are really not productive. A lot of times, less so in Takoma Park, we see acres and acres of lawns that are just there's so many issues there. But you can flip them very easily by just burying them under 8 to 12 inches of chip and then planting right through with plants. There's my contact information, and you can feel free to email me, and I can send you some of these lists and probably all kinds of technical information that you don't need. We also at the Research Center, Judy has been part of this in the past, and several other people perhaps here. I don't see anyone. But we have an entire 50-foot hoop house that we have donated to the surrounding community, to grow native plants. We have no deer, theoretically no deer, in our compounds, and we do all the watering, and we'll do the seed stratification for you. And to date, we have provided actually all the potting soil and the pots. That may change because we've just become too popular. But you have to do all the schlepping. So you have to do the transplanting and the maintenance of the flats and then the moving the plants. And then you move them out to wherever. So that's available to whoever wants to have that. And I will stop, and I'm sure that, as usual, I'm over my limit. And so I don't know if we want to do questions or not.
I think so. I think we want to do some questions. Yeah. Thank you, Sam. That was great. Every time I hear you, I learn something else. So for people in the audience, if you have a question, feel free to come up to either of the microphones.
And I'll just mention that so I'm telling you all these stories about these particular bee plant relationships. There's many, many more. We really have only just touched a tiny surface. Just email me and ask for our species accounts, and I can give you, send those to you, and you can read more about all the different kinds of plant-bee relationships and what's going on in the state. Yeah.
This is not entirely a question. Partly it's just to make the community aware that the city, through the Arts and Humanities Committee, commissioned a public work, artwork that's going to be displayed outside of the rec center on New Hampshire Avenue. And it's actually a structure that is at least designed to draw native bees. We'll see how it works.
All right.
But we could probably use some support to make sure it's at least minimally successful.
Yeah, good.
So-
And I'm again, anything that has, you want more information, I'm glad to provide. But this also brings up something Anna and I talked about, which is, Takoma Park, full of artists and full of all kinds of sculptural, interesting, quirky elements. What I think the challenge is to bring in the art community and say, we want you to develop a artistic landscape that excludes deer, right? So deer don't like certain kinds of structural elements that could be artistic and beautiful, and then within that you could plant native plants. I don't know if Anna went for that, but I thought that was like quirky. Okay.
Okay. Oh. Okay. Yeah. So we have a totally native straight species plant garden for 25 years, and maybe more than 25 now. And what we've noticed over the past decade or so is many, many insects are gone.
Mm-hmm.
No butterflies, hardly any. But we have a lot of bees.
Uh-huh.
And a lot of different kinds of bees, but I don't really know all the different kinds.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering, do you know why there's such a relative difference between the decimation of the butterfly population compared to what appears to be a relatively more abundant bee population?
Right. So a short answer is I don't know, but a bigger answer is there is a suspicion within the community, but it's been difficult to study and it's been difficult to get money to study it, which is the mosquito and fogger control thing. So you can go to Lowe's and buy a fogger and you just fill it with pesticides and you just blow it all over. You get Mosquito Joe, mosquito patrol people knocking on your door and saying, Frank down the road is doing his part to do these mosquitoes. You should hire us. And they're like, the co-ed who is talking to you on the doors, they're like, oh no, these pesticides don't impact pollinators. Well, it's not true. These are generalized insecticides. All the ones kill all the insects. So, and then you have contractors who are hired to do the spraying, and they're supposed to do it within certain kinds of limits. But if you're a contractor and you don't spray, you don't get paid. So it's like, it's not that windy. And so we feel like a lot of formerly a suburban area, an urban area had lots and lots of insects because it was a subsidized environment. So the rest of the environment, like in the natural system, there's a natural waning in the middle of summer of bloom and all kinds of insect activity. But within a subsidized urban suburban environment, your garden, it may even be watered during the year. So actually there was a lot of action going on. But that seems to be reversing, and we're concerned, but I don't have an answer, that a lot of this mosquito spraying may be part of the answer to why you're not seeing as many.
But why does it affect the bees too?
Yeah, I don't, this is part of the
Okay.
thing. I don't really know.
Oh, okay.
But if you're a caterpillar and you don't go underground at night, so most of the bees are in away and in a nest, and so depending on when and where you spray could be part of that answer. And there is probably even more complex than
Okay.
I can talk about. But yes, that's been seen.
Okay.
We've got a couple questions from folks online. There's been about 40 people online tonight, which is great. One person is asking, under the urging of Mike Chesick, Takoma Park has done a good job reconnecting natural areas fragmented apart. How does this help the pollinator bee species?
Yeah, so it probably helps other species more than pollinators per se. So the more natural habitat, the more native plants, the better for pollinators. As you know, there got to be blooming plants. But the connectivity is a little bit different for bees. Bees are incredible dispersers. So if you think about it, a bee is emerging in whenever it's supposed to emerge. So some emerge spring, summer, fall, with no information from any other members of its community. Its mom and dad are dead, and it has no brothers and sisters that it's communicating with because they're almost all solitary. So it emerges, and now it has to find this particular subset of plants in the environment. So it is going to start searching. Theoretically, it should be nearby, right? Because it came out of a nest for a reason. But if it's not, it just keeps flying and looking and does that until it either finds something or it's dead. So it can do miles and miles into non-habitat. So that means everyone's yard is within striking distance of most of the native bees within the region, but it's going to pass over your yard if you don't have the right plants. So that gets back to the native habitat. Most of those native habitats, like we did the studies in Sligo Creek already, right, have really healthy populations of bees that reflect what plants are blooming there. The connectivity is just less of an issue as compared to, say, native mice and the birds and the reptiles and the amphibians, because a bee can fly. It's just like, I don't care. I'm just going to hop over to Silver Spring and see if there's some heuchera plants over there, that kind of thing.
We've got a couple more, but you can go ahead.
Hello, thank you. My name is Deja, and I loved your presentation and learned a lot from the time that I was here. I wanted to just say thank you for your knowledge. It's just so wonderful to hear. And I am a lover of bees and all pollinators. I'm actually the artist that won the Hexa Habitat. Thank you.
Yay.
Thank you, the designer for it. I'm working with another person who's not here, but I represent us both. And I would just really love to talk to you and maybe like collaborate your expertise to help make our community so wonderful, because the whole idea behind the Hexa Habitat, it was connecting communities between the insect and pollinators with the humans, and having that connection where we can help each other. And I just wanted to say that to you, and just ask, later on, would love to reach out, and just wanted to formally introduce myself.
Well, if you don't have my email from there, then you can find it on the web pretty easily, but also you can talk to Anna or anyone else. And I really would love to talk to you, because my partner is also an artist. So I know these kinds of intersections a little bit. And I think that would be fun to do something.
Yes.
All right, so let's talk, and
Thank
you can
you.
come out to visit, as can anyone else, the research center, and see all the different kinds of bee and bee plant things that we do.
All right, I would love that. Thank
Okay.
you so much.
You bet.
Alexandra Ralph online is asking, what are some of the best practices for garden maintenance, especially springtime, to prevent unwanted disturbance of bee cocoons and overwintering bees?
Yeah, I think what he's referring to is that there is a notion, and it's a good one, that if you are overly tidy, you're actually sweeping up a lot of insect nests and pupae and other creatures, and then taking them off to the compost pile or somewhere else. So that's less of a case for bees, except that people have an idea that a lot of these bees are nesting in the stems of your perennial plants. So the short answer is so we're ignoring carpenter bees for the second, but that bees cannot break through, because they have very weak mandibles, through the stem wall of your plants. So what they need is they actually need deer or a gardener to cut and break open the plant stems, and then they can invade some like hollow stems and some like pithy stems, because they use the soft pith to create their nests, but it has to be cut. So the in-between here is to cut your perennials in the fall about of 8 inches to a foot, and particularly if you're have planted blackberries and raspberries, so the brambles, because you have a cycle where it's only the second year stem that is producing, and then you cut that down. So usually people, again, a little too tidy, and they cut everything to the ground. So if you leave it about a foot up, you have created a whole bunch of plant nesting opportunities for bees that use plants. But simply having a not, let's call it natural but not tidy looking plant garden bed isn't that helpful per se. So I think the thing to avoid is overworking the ground. So let's say you have a bunch of trees, so instead of raking up everything all the time, you should basically just leave as much as is tolerable by your sensibilities and your neighbor's sensibilities, those leaves on the ground and the twigs on the ground. And in your garden beds, you can leave, like the stuff you're cutting down, you can just put that back into the bed, or leave some of it there. So you want to disturb the soil as little as possible. So even within a vegetable garden, and also there's this whole regenerative, very interesting regenerative notion within agriculture that basically says you want to disturb the soil layer as little as possible, because you have all these advanced fungal networks and bacterial populations and things that when you turn over the soil, you're basically asking them to start all over. The same would be true of all the insects that live in there. Maybe they can make it through. So a lot of bees are nesting in the ground. So if you turn over the soil, you are at least getting rid of some of them just through direct disturbance. So that would be my general kind of message.
I think we can do maybe 2 more.
Okay.
To build on what you're talking about before, when specialist bees emerge and their plants are not there, what senses do they use? Is it just visual or by scent, or how do they locate the other plants?
Yeah, so some of this we're inferring. I'm not even sure how much experimental things are on there, but when you think about a plant, right? If it has a big colorful bloom, that's part of the plant's app for attracting bees. So that whatever it is, most of the stuff that we plant in our gardens are even the varieties are basically still, like if it's a big blue flower, it was in the wild a big blue flower, and blue is a color that plant's bees really like. So it's the color of the flower, the shape of the flower are important in terms of the searching for the bee species. Additionally, we know that many plants have a scent that we can detect even, right? And so we have really lousy detectors. Our nose is not very fine, but a bee has these antennae, and those are essentially its nose, and it's detecting things at the parts per trillion. It's a really fine-tuned mechanism for connecting the bee to the plant group. So again, I don't know that literature. But the idea is the plant is producing these things for a reason. It's producing a flower for a reason. That's the visual element. And that's how we actually catch a lot of bees. We set up traps that are just colored traps of different kinds, and they end up in that trap. And then the scent is another, once a bee locks into a particular flower that it's visiting, it can find more of them, which may be dispersed low, hard to find, in pockets by using its antennae.
So it's primarily sight and scent, nothing
Yeah.
else? Okay.
Yep, that's,
Thank you.
yeah.
Hi. I'm curious, you made a recommendation about there should only be mowing once a year for like municipalities. And I
Yeah.
thought that was a great
Well,
idea.
Yeah, that's
But-
a very easy to remember one.
Right. But I guess I was wondering, many localities have ordinances around height and make homeowners, or people who rent or whatever,
Right.
cut their sidewalks or cut their, yards, and that's been. I'm wondering I'm wondering what you think of that.
Yeah.
And then also, like, have you seen that change now because of the growing interest in native bees?
Well, I could just look at Takoma Park over the years, and I know there's been a change in terms of what people are doing with their lawns and their landscapes. So to answer your question, though, more directly, it's really a intersection of biology and aesthetics, and people's perceptions of both of those. So the traditional safe approach is everything is mowed, and like nobody goes to jail for that one or gets an ordinance slapped. Like, you mowed too much. That's not a thing. Then everything else becomes a value judgment that the community is labeling. So in Takoma Park, you can get away with probably more naturalized bed types of situations than in other locations. But there is a paper, and I don't know it offhand, but they looked at these kinds of things. And what they found is that it's acceptable to have naturalized landscapes, but you have to have neat edges. So in other words, your sidewalk area, your drive area, your fence lines, and all need to be basically what we would now call string trimmed, right? So it's got to be really tight. And then what becomes then acceptable is what's to the interior, right? We don't know what you're doing, but you are doing it on purpose. We can tell you haven't simply, passed away, and therefore we probably should mow your ground for you. You're saying this is important, and also the public spaces, i.e., that sidewalk, that street, and everything are the places that people are going to inspect the most. So that's the most important front-facing thing. Additionally, what also is important in the acceptable to non-acceptable arena is around the house. So yes, it's not right on the road, but when you are right around the house, it shouldn't be like all of our naturalized landscape are just crawling up to the house. You want this buffer of floral beds and traditional, sculpted shrubs or something that, again, doesn't look like the house is abandoned. So those are the two elements that came out to be extremely important in terms of how a community perceived a person who was trying to help nature, had pollinator gardens and things. And once those elements were achieved, then we don't know what you were doing with all that stuff in the middle, but it's okay because, you have done it clearly. You've made a statement. We're doing this on purpose. So I do see people doing, like the hell strip between the sidewalk and the street. I see people doing things there all the time. I think it just depends on the neighbors in the neighborhood and probably what you've planted in there and how, tight it is in terms of weeding. And again, does that plant look like a weed to the average person?
Right.
Or are they all in a row? Are they beautiful and blooming? Do they meet the specs? So you're at a higher inspection rate when you're working at that health strip right next to the sidewalk where the community's going, and if it's draping over and blah, blah, blah. So, that's my answer.
Thank you. I hope we can also get rid of those kinds of ordinances.
Yeah, good luck with that. So. All right, so
So,
we're good.
yeah, thank you again to Sam and to the partners at Climate Action Coffee. This has been really a fun event for me, and I hope you guys were inspired as well.
Yeah.